This is the Content Strategy Insights Podcast, episode number 202. As we write our shopping lists and organize our thoughts, we all practice taxonomy and think semantically every day. Some of us get to do these practices professionally. Fran Alexander is a taxonomist based in Montreal. She's also the reigning Taxonomy Bootcamp Practitioner of the Year. As she's realized that there will always be more semantic work to be done than there are trained practitioners, she added democratizing taxonomy to her to-do list.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights Podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 202 of the Content Strategy Insights Podcast. I am really delighted today to welcome to the show Fran Alexander. Fran is a taxonomist based in Montreal in Canada. She's also the reigning Taxonomy Bootcamp Practitioner of the Year. So she's a rock star in the taxonomy world. So welcome, Fran. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Well, thanks, Larry. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to talk to you about taxonomies and democratizing taxonomies. One thing that's top of mind for me and that gives a bit of context, I think, to the work that I've done and the changes that I've seen over, the last couple of decades, really, is that we used to build taxonomies to help machines understand humans. Now we're building taxonomies to help humans understand machines. So we've done a lot of foundational work to kind of set up intelligent systems and organize our concepts and our context to create knowledge bases, knowledge graphs, and so on. And now AI is coming in and is so elaborate and sophisticated. We as humans are having to step back and try and understand and explain and work with the complexities of that world. So there's really been a huge shift, and it's fascinating. It makes it a really great field to be working in.
The way you just said that is business booming these days for the taxonomy folks? Has AI made
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would assume.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of excitement, obviously, over the last few years with the rise of AI and LLMs, but that's also brought into focus the importance of knowledge and the importance of well-structured knowledge and the importance of really good semantic layers is what people are talking about now to support those AI applications and to support those LLMs. If you've got really good, well-described knowledge in a way that machines can process and understand, then that artificial intelligence, those applications that sit over the top are so much more effective and accurate and explainable and so on. So I really feel that taxonomy and semantics kind of go in and out of the spotlight, but there's huge interest at the moment. It really is a kind of boom time for taxonomy and taxonomists.
Yeah, I was at the semantics conference a couple of weeks ago in Amsterdam, and there was palpable excitement and even giddiness about the need for semantic help. And a lot of it goes to what you were just saying about AI and the need to go and that progression you described of from AI and LLMs, and then that illustrating the importance for well-structured knowledge. That's almost kind of like when you look at like a maturity model or I don't know what you call it, but like that sort of evolution of like ways to manage descriptions of, categorizations and descriptions of things. Can you talk a little bit about like we talked before we went on the air a little bit about like everything from folksonomies to a full-blown ontology, but there's lots of stuff in between too.
Sure, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because actually some of the earliest forms of writing known to history are lists and catalogues. And so that's like Hittite tablets and Sumerian king lists and so on. And they're kind of inventories, stock lists. Those were the first things that people, at least as far as we know, those were the first kind of things that people were writing down. And so that really is the first point of knowledge organization is that you make a list. Now, we're all very, very familiar with lists and how useful they are, but a list is your kind of first step. But as you get more and more information, once your list starts to get bigger, you need to divide your list up to make it usable and manageable into categories and subcategories. And at that point, you're starting to build a taxonomy. But then you need to go one step further. As you get more and more content that you want to understand and manage, you want to move away from a simple mono-hierarchical taxonomy to start building graphs and have concepts that can belong in more than one subcategory on your list. And at that point, you're starting to build a graph. Taxonomies obviously focus on the hierarchy, broader and narrower, to allow you to zoom in and out and find things through that kind of browse mechanism. Is the kind of fundamentals of taxonomy. But then you start to want to add in synonyms and related concepts. So you start to build up a thesaurus. And thesauruses are where you have all the different words for the same concept. And that's a kind of very fundamental point in semantics. It's why we need semantics, because we have so many different words for the same thing. And we need to organize that. And then ontologies come in as you start to define those relationships. How do your lists, how do your taxonomies relate to each other? And you start to put in some logical rules, and your ontology then starts to build up your whole worldview and your perspective. And at that point, when you've got your ontology and you start to have the actual data that you're working with, the actual information, you've got a knowledge graph. And that is something that you then need to support your LLMs and work with your LLMs to get really good results. And that's kind of how you evolve from starting off with lists and tags and labels, and build up through to the sophisticated knowledge ecosystems that we're working with now.
Right. As you set out that sort of escalation of organization schemes, I realized that I'm reminded of something else we talked about earlier, is this notion that we're all already doing a lot of this stuff already. You just happen to do it professionally and have very precise and like ISO standards and stuff that you're working to. But everybody does shopping lists and then goes, well, I need to organize it by aisle, or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about, like, because you're like, the whole theme of this conversation is the democratization, and that's sort of like pre-democratization. People are already poised for this. So assuming we have a slam dunk here in terms of democratizing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are all taxonomists kind of all the time. So one example that I like to use is supermarkets. Mentioning shopping lists, the way that a supermarket is organized, that's effectively a taxonomy. You've got the dairy section, and then within the dairy section, you've got the milk, and you've got the different types of milk and cheese and so on. Well, that's a taxonomy. Whenever you organize your folders on your desktop, or you go into your email inbox and you start tagging your emails and organizing those into a folder structure, you're doing taxonomy work. So in the kind of digital age, we put hashtags on our Instagram posts. All that kind of work is effectively taxonomy work. You may not think of yourself as a taxonomist, and I think the word taxonomy often kind of either intrigues people or scares them a little bit. And I'm convinced this has got, because it's got an X in the middle of it, it makes it sound like a very, very interesting word. But building those lists and categories and subcategories and so on, we do it all the time. But as you say, there's a big difference between what you do in your own personal inbox, for example, take your own personal email inbox, and what we do at scale for knowledge organization for a large enterprise or a large business. So, if you do, and as a kind of amateur taxonomist, you can certainly start off with your own email. Because if you get that wrong, if you make a complete mess of that and the categories don't make any sense and it's really hard for you to find things, well, that's only really going to impact you. Once you're working professionally for an organization and there's lots and lots of people involved, and the taxonomy is maybe being expressed in the information architecture of a site, and that's how you're making your money and so on, or the knowledge assets that you're organizing, I'm thinking like maybe in legal knowledge management, that can be really important and really critical. Lawyers have to be really sure they've got good knowledge and information systems for the work that they do. So So doing that professionally, I'd say that's a lot of what taxonomy professionals are doing are just working at a size and at a scale and with knowledge that has a really huge impact and commercial value, importance, and so on. And so that's the difference. But it kind of all starts off the same thing in the same way.
And how do you, I guess, because we're off, as you mentioned, that there's sort of like the intermediate step between that scale you just mentioned and the individual, like organizing your desktop or your mailbox. Kind of in between that, I see it all the time. I've done it a lot. Is this notion like you're working on a product or a project or something like that, and you're like, oh, we have a lot of things here. We need to list them out, and then that seems like that's often a starting point for like at some point in that I've often got to the point where like, oh, I need professional taxonomy help here. How do you know when to call Fran, I guess?
Well, yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I would say if you find you're getting stuck, if things are not working and you're not sure how to fix them, if you need to do something that has a large scale and has a criticality to it, then, and you're justifying investment and expense and so on, you can have huge impacts. So then it is important not to think about what you're doing and to have a plan and to have governance and to have policies and to have processes. And this is where we make the difference between just kind of, putting a few concepts together in an Excel spreadsheet and actually thinking through, is this taxonomy really working? What's its function? Is it serving its users? Does it match the mental model? So this is one of the questions that I often find myself asking. Does it match do the concepts that we're putting together and the structure that we're putting together in a taxonomy match the mental model of the people who are going to be using and engaging with that taxonomy? And in terms of kind of democratizing the process, I think it's a really interesting one for organizations. There's so much taxonomy work, there's so much knowledge management work that needs to happen, there's so much semantics, that the more you can democratize good practice across everyone in the organization, the better your knowledge and information will flow, the better organized you'll be. Taxonomy practice is really good. The theory behind taxonomy work, it's really good at encouraging clear communication and clear thinking. So what makes a good taxonomy, whether it is for your emails in your inbox or for something that's driving say shopping on a website that lots of people are going to interact with, is it's that clarity. So have you got good, clear, unambiguous labels? Have you really thought about what this concept is and what it's doing and how what words you should use to express that? Can people look at that and understand it? And then the mutual exclusivity of categories sounds very grand. But actually what we're doing when we look at that is we're saying, is it clear that this thing belongs here and this thing belongs somewhere else? And if people are confused and they go, I don't know which category this thing should belong in, maybe the categories are not clear. Maybe there's something wrong there. And this is a little bit, when should you call in Fran? If you've got something that doesn't seem to be working, people can't figure out how to navigate your website. People don't know where to look for the assets. You've got categories, but nobody knows how to apply those tags, because it may well be that your categories are not clear, they're not well expressed, they're not differentiating what you need to differentiate for the particular purpose and for the particular use case, what you're trying to do.
Yeah, that's it. Well, and you just used like the first half of that thing, mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, like a place for everything in its place. And I guess, so that's one way you're like, oh, shoot, there's this thing off to the side. I don't know where to put it. Or you have a bunch of empty boxes or something like that. That's when you call Fran, or one of the places that you call Fran. Yeah.
Yeah. And then we look, you can look at, well, what are you trying to do? Why are you trying to separate? Do you need to separate these things out? Have you expressed clearly? Can you articulate what the difference is between these things? Or is there something, are these things that really sit in between categories? I'm fascinated by boundary objects, the things that fall between two categories, and how do you make them findable? And I'm thinking of things like where you get things that serve multiple purposes, like when you're shopping for things that could be one thing or the other, could be used in different ways, or like types of footwear that might be good hiking shoes but are also good for walking around town. You wouldn't necessarily want to categorize them in one place or another, but can you make them findable in these different ways that people think about them or would use them, and so on. And that's somewhere where the art of taxonomy work comes in. So there's a lot of science in taxonomy work. There's a lot of things that we can do, a lot of number crunching that we can do, a lot of UX work and information architecture work where you can put categories and concepts in front of people and understand their mental model and how they understand them, and see if you're getting things right, and people able to navigate through this system. You can test that. But there's also the art of coming up with the wording and coming up with the ways of dividing up your content in a way that's really useful in the particular context that you're working in.
Yeah, because so much of that is like people stuff, right? Like you said earlier, agreeing on the terms and getting and understanding their mental models. That reminded me of a thing. I don't know if you follow Jorge Arango, the information architect. He's one of the co-authors of the Polar Bear book. He did this brilliant blog post a couple of years ago about different kinds of models, because I'm a modeler, so apologies for going off on this. But he talked about mental models, conceptual models, where you kind of like, those are the sharing things where you kind of say, hey, do I understand this correctly? Do we agree on what we're doing with? And then implementation models. Is there sort of a similar thing going on in taxonomy practice? Like you mentioned the mental models, important to understand those. Or do you kind of work with a conceptual model and then ensconce it in some kind of a system?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that I would say really, a lot of taxonomies are particularly conceptual models. And in fact, one of the ways that I like to describe ontologies is I say an ontology is a map of important ideas. And that what you're doing is you're looking for the conceptual model, and you can use those conceptual models to make sure you've got clear communication. So you should have when you build a taxonomy, you should know what the function or the purpose of that taxonomy is. And there are different types of taxonomies that can do very different things. I talk about descriptive taxonomies and operational taxonomies a lot. So descriptive taxonomies tend to be taxonomies where you're doing things like content management. So you're wanting to say tag images or tag videos so you can find them again. And the set of concepts that you use for those tags should match the mental model of the people who are doing the research and who are trying to retrieve and find those assets. So those are very descriptive. And so you can look at, what's a conceptual model that makes sense to us from the point of view of the assets that we've got. These are all videos of types of animals. Then we're going to want lots of concepts around animals and different types of animals. But do we know how the people who are searching for those different types of animals, what are they doing? Are they working, are they vets, or are they animal rescue people, and so on? And they'll have different perspectives and different viewpoints. So you want to test your conceptual model and make sure it aligns with their conceptual model. And when you get those into alignment, then you've got a successful system. And we also have, and then operational taxonomies tend to be quite technical. And they're interesting because they might be ones that are sort of working behind the scenes to organize functions and maybe process business rules, encode kind of do like logical operations to do data quality checks and validations and so on. And those tend to be a little bit different because you can test those in much more functionally. Are they working? Are they achieving the results we expect to achieve through this process?
That's interesting.
But again, it's a question, it's a question of lining up the results with what you're trying to achieve and making sure everything's making sense.
Mm-hmm. That sort of sets up a question that just occurred to me, like, how do you know that a taxonomy is working? That sounds like one way, that you have these operational metrics and things, but are there other sort of metrics or criteria that you look at to make sure taxonomy is doing its job?
So there's a lot. So again, with depending on the different types of taxonomy, with descriptive taxonomies, it really is really looking at that kind of function. What am I trying to do by describing my assets? Who am I trying to serve with this taxonomy? What's the business reason for having this taxonomy? Is it trying to help people find products when they're shopping on a website? Is it to help lawyers access the right documents they need? Can they find the legal case precedents and so on? Are you getting relevant results in the search? And so you can test that. You can set up reference questions. I mean, that's something that comes into ontology design a lot. What questions do I want this ontology to answer? Do I have a good understanding of the domain? What am I trying to do? And then you can build metrics around that depending on the particular function. So am I retrieving the right assets? If I'm looking for images, am I getting the right set of images? And am I getting all the relevant images? And those things are testable and scoreable. You can look at, if it's a website, if it's a shopping website, you can make a change to the taxonomy and you should be able to see an improvement in people being able to find things and buy things. So there should be a kind of a commercial, an increase in profit that's coming through that, more increased sales, those kind of metrics. There are other things. If you're doing something more operational, is it making a system more efficient? And you can go and talk to people. Is this helping this system run better? Are we getting better data quality? Can we compare states of data and measure that? Do people like using it? That's a really good, and that's the same, whether it's how you've organized your email inbox or whether how you've organized some knowledge organization structures in an organization and in a large organization. If people enjoy engaging with the taxonomy, and if the model that you've created fits their mental model and has simplified all the complexity that we're working with, and people like using it, then that's a huge measure of success.
Yeah, that's really, because I have, like, when I think of the people I know who listen to these podcasts, that there's a variety, like designers, editorial people, operations managers, all of them, and they all have slightly different, they would regard the efficiency of the system. But one of the things you might look at, a lot of them are working like in a CMS, and the way they might be exposed to a taxonomy is through like tagging or categorizing something as they enter it. I guess that gets into a little bit like the tooling, like how are people assuming like the taxonomy is just there and has been done? There's sort of like the use of taxonomy, the consumption of a good taxonomy. What does that look like typically, do you think?
So certainly in the kind of systems that I've worked with, you're usually building a taxonomy for some kind of tagging or indexing system. And it's usually driving some kind of retrieval in some way. So like you say, a CMS or a DAM system, you want to be able to tag and index the assets that are in that CMS and that DAM in order that you can go and grab and fetch just the right assets that you need, the relevant assets at the right moment. So that covers everything from publishing use cases, putting content elements onto a page to publish them, search and research use cases, through all sorts of other use cases, recommendation systems, personalization, that's becoming a big one now, that kind of relevance. What is out of the huge, vast amounts of content and digital assets that we have now, how do we decide what's relevant for a particular user to personalize? What can we recommend? And so using those similarities, the links between concepts, being able to line up your kind of user profile that says this person's interested in these things, and we have, this person's interested in art and music. We have these assets. The taxonomy tells us that we have these assets tagged art and music. tells us that there's a connection between art and art galleries. So we can then make a connection and say, oh, well, there happens to be an art gallery we know about that's nearby. So let's surface up this art gallery. Let's recommend this art gallery to this user while they're interacting. Let's put a nice image of that art gallery and say, maybe you'd like to go to this art gallery while you're in the neighborhood. So those kind of links and connections, recommendations, personalizations, that kind of the way things fit together in the world. It's very, very powerful.
And the way you described the personalization use case, it's hard to imagine doing that without taxonomy. Like, I don't know how you could. Yeah. Like, you have to have a tech on both sides. And especially at scale. So many of the personalization use cases I've seen are just around marketing. And I see a lot of opportunities in other places like, e-commerce and I guess in e-commerce, you do see a lot of recommendation engines, but do you see other places where taxonomy is underutilized, like other benefits that you see every day that just aren't being exploited well in enterprises or other places?
I think there's a couple of things. So obviously the big hot topic at the moment is improving LLMs, results from LLMs and AIs and intelligent systems, and really scaling up that ability to have. Really what you're talking about doing is giving those AI systems really good conceptual models of the world that are human models of the world, so that they can then do all their clever processing and come up with results that really work in particular contexts and particular ways. But I'm also actually very interested in the kind of logical business rules, encoding logical business rules. So something that is kind of a little bit new to me is not just having the descriptive taxonomies that have the sort of classic taxonomy, this is art, what comes into art, impressionism, expressionism, who are the artists, and so on. But actually going, okay, we can do a little bit more. We can give the developers and the engineers more information about how these concepts should relate to each other, how you should use them. We can encode bits of logical rules into those taxonomy graphs to give instructions about when to use certain concepts in relation to other concepts, how to order results, how to weight results, how to associate, look for changes when something changes in one taxonomy, how does that affect other taxonomies, how can we use those kind of ontological rules to say this class of things needs to behave in a certain way, or this class of data has certain qualities to it. So you can then compare data sets conceptually and create inferences and improve data quality, improve performance, identify anomalies, identify things that are incomplete, create links and associations that you might not have seen before. And so that's with lots of like business operations, sometimes that can be very small scale and technical, and sometimes it can be very, very wide ranging. But that to me is a really interesting new development.
Yeah, that ensconcing of business logic and rules in these, and that the way you just described that sounds like a full-blown ontology. Is that, I guess, and this kind of gets beyond, I actually do a whole other podcast on knowledge graphs, and we should probably talk over there sometime about that. But I do think people are going to be exposed more to that kind of stuff in, the emerging RAG architectures, and there's a lot of content stuff in and around that. So can you talk maybe just a little bit about the connection between ontologies and knowledge graphs?
Yeah. So some people say that ontologies are knowledge graphs in their own right, but I think that the kind of common definition is that your ontology, as I said before, it's like a map of important ideas, and one way that I explain how ontologies and taxonomies work together is that your taxonomies tend to be those nice hierarchical lists. So a kind of familiar one is like countries of the world, geography. You've got your continents, you've got your countries, you've got your capital cities, and you can organize that in a hierarchical structure. But your ontology, what your ontology is doing is saying how things like that, how countries might relate to, say, people, or how literature might relate to people and places. And it's the ontology that explains how the taxonomies relate to each other, what relationships they can have, what logical rules can be applied. But that's kind of a schema. It's a bit like a schema. It is a map. It's a plan of how all that information connects up. But when it really becomes a full knowledge graph and kind of comes to life to be able to answer real questions for your business, is when you bring in the actual instance data. These are our particular customers. This customer was born in this place and they've bought these products and they like to read these books and their favorite genre is this. And when you've got that individual instance data, that's what gives you a full knowledge graph. So the ontology explains how all that fits together, is the organizational principle. Your taxonomies are giving you your kind of options, almost like your drop-down list you can pick from. And then the whole thing, when you've got that real data coming in of actual transactions, actual customers, that's what makes your knowledge graph.
Fantastic, because I think that term is popping up more and more. So that's a great overview. Yeah. Thanks. Hey, Fran, I can't believe it. We're coming up on time. I warned you that this would go way too quick. But before we wrap up, is there anything you want to make sure we share before we close?
Well, I would particularly like to give a shout out to Taxonomy Bootcamp London. Bite-sized Taxonomy Bootcamp. The next one is on October the 9th. They're really good. If you're interested in learning more about taxonomies, they're really good. Highly recommend those. We'll be discovering who the next taxonomy practitioner of the year is at the next one. So yeah, and I really enjoy going to their events, and it's a really great part of the community. So yeah, Taxonomy Bootcamp London, check that out.
I've been to many of those. I can also recommend it. And I just took a sneak peek at my calendar. This episode will drop the day before. Well, aim to drop this on October 8th. So people will still have time to register. Hey, and one very, very last thing, Fran, if people want to connect or follow you online, what's the best place to find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. There are quite a few Fran Alexanders on LinkedIn, but if you look for Fran Alexander Taxonomist Montreal on LinkedIn, you will find me. And that's a good way to get in touch.
Excellent. I'll put that in the show notes as well, of course. Well, thanks so much, Fran. Always fun to talk. This was a really great conversation.
Well, thank you, Larry. Appreciate it. Always enjoy talking to you too.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.